I'm sitting here with Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and I've been following you for a really long time.
Yeah,
But
we met in person too in Duluth.
where was that?
I think it was at a RPR thing or something, wasn't it?
No, I don't think we ever
Or no,
met.
wait,
I I don't think we met in Duluth.
maybe
I
we
used to
didn't.
intern at University of Minnesota.
Yeah, I
So
know
that was
that.
kind of we both had been around Cal.
Yeah, we've been around
But
Cal way too much, so it'll warp your brain. That's what happens.
yeah, no, I don't think we have ever met.
Oh, you might not have.
So I recently I reached out to you because recently I listened to your show with John Heck. You were on his, he was on yours, and you guys
Yeah.
were talking about this metabolic health, metabolic flexibility, and in the tendon world, there's this big thing on metabolic health, and it's all the extremes. So yeah, today we're gonna try to get into maybe the less extremes, and maybe what things metabolism means for tendon health. But before we get into that, tell everyone a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, so I run a company, Extreme Human Performance. Been training people, God, since I got my first NSCA CSCS cert. Was training people in person 2005 now, so 20 years. It just makes me just some old bastard now. I did my undergrad at St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science, minor in chemistry, minor in math. Did 2 years postgraduate work, Michigan Tech, 2.5 years there for a master's in mechanical engineering. I worked in the medical device industry for about 10 years on implantable pacemakers, defibrillators. Went back to school for PhD work in biomedical engineering for almost 4 years. Decided I wasn't going to do that the rest of my life, so switched over to exercise physiology, and that took another 7 years. Finished my PhD there, which was in metabolic flexibility and heart rate variability. So right now, live in Minnesota, do a fair amount of traveling, teaching, associate professor for the Carrick Institute, and work with a fair amount of clients online from God, wide variety from all over the world, from post-cancer patients to higher level athletes from UK, Australia, Canada, US. Kind of, my marketing person yells at me all the time because he's like, "Well, what kind of people do you work with?" I'm like, 70% of them are actually women, even though I write to dudes on my newsletter, and they're all just kind of stuck with some problem they can't figure out. So I try to use a very systematic point of view for everything from neurology to metabolism to biomechanics. And if I can't figure it out, at least know enough people in the industry to direct them where to go. So it's just kind of people who just get really stuck and nobody can figure out why, which I don't know how you put that in a niche.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, how did you get started on this metabolic flexibility? How'd you have this idea that this is what you're gonna research?
I actually didn't. When I switched from the PhD program in biomedical engineering, I hadn't started research because part of it was I had a big conflict of interest with the medical device company I was working with, and then I finished all the classwork except for literally one class, and I'm sitting in there in this class on MRI, so I had to take an electrical engineering objective, and I get in there first day, and the guy's like, "We are now going to derive all the equations used in an MRI," and just starts writing stuff on the board. And I'm looking at this going, I don't even know what symbols he's writing on the board. At this point, I had like a minor in mathematics. And so I poked the guy next to me. It was all basically math and physics people in the class. He's just frantically writing shit down. I'm like, hey, man, do you know what's going on? He's like, no. And he's just like writing stuff down on a paper. And I found out later there was another, I don't know if it was freaking Bessel equations or what. There's another math requirement that I didn't have and they didn't check me for. And so after 2 days of this going, "Okay, what am I doing?" Like, if I somehow manage to miraculously pass this class, okay, I'll probably stay and do this, but I'm really spending all my free time taking my minor was in physiology, reading physiology stuff, working with clients, doing more continuing ed, like from everything from neurology to soft tissue stuff with Tom Myers to RPR, be activated, all that kind of stuff. And so I decided to switch to the exercise physiology program. So once you're in the PhD program, to switch departments is relatively easy. So I went over there and started in fall. In the first meeting, my advisor walks in and he's like, "Hey, we've got two brand new projects. One's on metabolic flexibility and one's on heart rate variability." And he looks around the table and he points at me and he was like, "Hey, you, math boy, whatever your name is, like, these are your projects now." I was like, "Oh, shit. I came here, like, to stop doing math, and now what do I get? More math." But, luckily the math wasn't, I mean, comparatively speaking, like, what I had done before wasn't really that bad. I was doing different types of variability analysis and some other stuff. And at the time, I'd never even heard of the term metabolic flexibility. This is, God, probably 2006, I think, 2007. David Kelly was the first guy who coined the term metabolic flexibility in a paper in 2001, 2000. And my other guy who was helping in the department, he explained it to me. And my first thought was, so? Like, yeah, your body uses carbs, it uses fats. Like, why is this even a thing? Like, who gives a rat's ass? And then I thought, oh, I wonder if it changes. I wonder, can you do anything to modify it? Because if you can't modify it, then who cares is pretty much worthless. So, went back and just started reading all the literature I could find on it. And then you realize, oh, yeah, so you can sort of lose the ability to use fat. You can sort of lose the ability to use carbohydrates. You can upregulate both ends of the spectrum. You can control how fast you're switching back and forth. And so it turns out I'm like, oh, this is just a cool way of trying to explain at a high level basic human metabolism. And then at the time, you spend any amount of time in the fitness world, as we talked about, like it's all, oh, it's got to be high carb or high fat, or no, it's keto only, or protein will destroy your kidneys. Like no one, even now, like rarely talks about like, hey, shocker, all these fuel systems are integrated in the body. It just depends on what you're doing and when you're doing it. And so, from a marketing standpoint, it allowed me to air quote talk about one thing in a specific niche with a single term, but in reality let me talk about fat metabolism, lactate, ketones, like pretty much the whole gamut of metabolism without trying to explain all that to people in a your standard elevator pitch type thing.
Okay. Um, yeah. All right. You said a lot of things there. The um,
You use lots of
metabolic
words.
metabolic flexibility. That's, you know what, when I see your name though, when anyone sees your name, like it's immediately like, oh, metabolic flexibility. That's kind of what we know you for. So your marketing guy will like to hear that.
Yes, they'll make them happy.
Metabolic flexibility. Can you yeah, can you explain to me what yeah, what is this? You said things like you lose the ability to use carbs and fats, you can accelerate going back and forth between the two. So yeah, what's going on with this metabolic flexibility? And to add another question on that, this, so we have protein, carb, fat. Is protein just always like kind of a minor factor going on, and then the big two are the carbs and the fats?
Yeah, so to answer the last question first, from metabolism of fuels being used in the body, under vast majority of circumstances, like protein isn't really used much as a fuel. If you get into starvation conditions and some extreme things, burn patients, highly catabolic situations, you will kind of use more protein, but in general, you use a small amount. You primarily use the amino acid alanine goes into some of the different metabolic processes. Glutamine gets used a little bit, but for the most part, protein isn't really used much as a fuel. So the main fuels are going to be fats and carbohydrates. And with metabolic flexibility, there's just three components. So on kind of the right end of the spectrum, how well you can use carbohydrates. On the left end of the spectrum, how well you can use fat. And the third component is how well can you switch back and forth between those two. So if you're doing some, heavy weight training, it's to your best advantage to try to use as many carbohydrates as you can. Because the advantage carbohydrates have is you can create ATP, so cellular energy, at a much faster rate because you need energy and you need it in a very short time period. On the other end, when you're using fat, per basically unit of energy, you get way more ATP from fat than you do carbohydrates. The downside, though, is that it takes you longer to liberate all that ATP. So it takes you much longer time frame to do it. So when we're sitting here having this conversation, like fat is a much more preferred fuel source because there is no rate limit. We don't need to get energy really fast. The muscles are really not doing a whole lot. So there, and those things can change over time. So you can change how well your body uses fat. You can change how well it uses carbohydrates. So, for example, if you do a ketogenic diet, so a ketogenic diet is very low carbohydrate. Probably most people need to be under 50 grams of carbs per day, which includes fiber. So if you have like a half a bagel, like that's your carb limit for the day. But in that case, because you're running so much fat through the system, insulin is also very low, you will upregulate your body's use of fat as a fuel. However, the cost with that is you will downregulate your body's on the high end ability to use carbohydrates. So if you're a speed and power athlete, it'll probably cost you 8, 10, 12% right off your top end of speed and power. Which again, if you don't care about those qualities, probably not a big deal. But for anyone who's in athletics, like if you lose 10% of your speed and power, it's like, what did you do? You went from like performing well to like, you might be back to, washing tables again, you know? So in different contexts, those things make a big difference.
Hmm. Okay, so this ATP, yeah, but you get the quick ATP, carbohydrate, kind of slower
Hmm.
fat, but more. I've recently, I think Chris Masterjohn, that
Yeah.
name, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, so he was on a podcast, and then I listened because I had some people reach out about fluoroquinolone antibiotics for the tendons, and it's kind of been like back and forth whether they are harmful or not.
Yeah.
But he always is talking about ATP and mitochondria, and then like in that fluoroquinolone example, talking about tendon cells and maybe like dysregulation, something like that. So this metabolic flexibility, in terms of like at the cellular level, because they need energy to function. Yeah, does this idea of metabolic flexibility for performance? We have it of like, yeah, you get more carbohydrate usage, better strength, power, fats, maybe not so. Yeah, what's happening? It's not really a question, but what's happening at the cellular level? Yeah,
So let me know if this answers your question.
yeah.
There's a whole bunch of stuff that happened at the cellular level. Obviously, Chris Masterjohn has a test now to look at the different complexes in the mitochondria, is my understanding, to see which one is failing. Sounds cool. I haven't looked into it. Might be valid, might be not. I honestly haven't looked into it. So there's always lots of testing to try to figure out maybe at a cellular level what's going on. I would make the argument that we've got good testing at the high level physiologic system, and that's probably more important. And then if there's something off there, then you can kind of look deeper. So I take the inverse route of looking at, okay, with simply what is your output? What were you able to do? Those types of things. If you have access to a metabolic cart, so where you have the little mask on, you're breathing out air, the system is then looking at oxygen and CO2 usage. If you're a weirdo like me, you have a metabolic cart in your house, which is super fun to use. Not cheap, but fun. You can look at the muscle level by doing like NIRS technology, such as Moxie. That'll tell you local oxygen use. So you can put one of those on your right quad, left quad, maybe a non-working muscle like your shoulder, if you're doing a rowing or bike test. And that'll give you some pretty good data at a system level what's going on. How well are you using O2 and CO2, which will give you a surrogate marker for what's called RER, which is just simply the ratio of fat to carbohydrates you're using. You'll see airflow, you'll see respiration rate. The local sensors will tell you local muscle SMO2, so the use of oxygen at the local muscle. And then kind of probably be able to pinpoint like, okay, where is your rate limiter? Like, where are you kind of hanging up? And at that point, you then, or like what I would do is then, okay, let's try to go a little bit deeper. What is your nutrition? What is your stress? We can look at HRV. If you're very stressed, we know that that's going to push you more to the carbohydrate end of the spectrum most of the time, because that's your body's way of trying to deal with stress. So if your fat oxidation really just sucks and you can't recover from things, you feel like your body comp is all goofy, maybe your stress is super high. Maybe your calories are goofy. Maybe you don't have micronutrition. Maybe your sleep is a disaster. Maybe your VO2 is that of a field mouse, right? If your VO2 is like 25, which I've measured some people at 25, you're literally trying to redline your poor little 3-cylinder Yugo every time you go to the friggin' Cub Foods, right? Your engine is just too small for the capacity you want out of it. And of course, your fat oxidation, all of that stuff's going to suck. And you may end up all the way down at the mitochondrial level. Like I've done, I had a Dr. Herman Patel who does a mitochondrial test. I haven't talked to Chris about his test yet. So you might end up down at that level. I would say that the testing in those areas, I would say, is still, we don't really know how that scales up. And if you talk to more mitochondrial experts, there's this weird paradox where the mitochondria seems to be way overbuilt for the capacity that gets run through it. And maybe there's some type of, physiologic kind of headroom you have to have there to operate. It's very similar to glycogen use, right? So since what Bergstrom needle was what 1963, the first time we can, take a little needle and go whoop, stick it into the muscle and pull out like a pencil lead sized chunk of tissue and stick it under the microscope and throw it in blenders and do all sorts of crazy stuff with it. You can't really get much past, I think the lowest amount I've seen is maybe 30 or 40% muscle glycogen. Like you can absolutely torture these poor athletes with repeated ramp tests and wind gates and all this really heinous shit. And you do a biopsy, like 30, 40% is like as low as you can drive muscle glycogen. So there appears to be sometimes these set points where no matter what you do, you can't drive it to zero. It's not like your gas tank where you could just go all the way to zero and get stranded on the road. So maybe there's something like that with mitochondria, maybe not. Um, so yeah, that's how I would look at it. And again, I think you may end up at the cellular level, but there's also my little running joke is that physiology is full of every bad engineering word. It's anisotropic, it's chaotic, it's nonlinear. To run a lot of mental models to figure it out, it just rarely ever maps that way. However, if you still look at output and you still look at what is the system capable of doing, at least then you know if you're going in the right direction or not. If you're not going in the right direction, okay, then we'll take a systematic point of view and we're going to get deeper and deeper all the way. My pet peeve for a lot of just trainers in general is they just don't look at output. So my first question a lot of times in consult is like, okay, how do you know your athlete's worse? And again, you can use qualitative data, you can use whatever you want, but I would like to see some quantitative output, which again, easier like in, track and swimming and things like that. Gets much fuzzier in sports like, hockey and baseball and football and stuff like that. But either way, like start at a system-wide view and then you may end up all the way down at the cellular level, but it just gets messier and messier the further you go down.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That
I don't
makes a
even know
lot
if
of.
that answered your question.
It wasn't a very good question, but no, that makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah. Okay. Maybe around that a little bit. You had these three tiers of this metabolic flexibility. The first one, well, yeah, how well you can use carbs. What does that look like when you're good at using them? When you're bad at using them? What are the negatives when you can't? Yeah.
Yeah, so the biggest negative is a drop in speed and power. So if you're not even doing muscle biopsies, which I'd not recommend people to do at home, there is some ultrasound technology that might allow us to do that in the future. I'd say right now it's very mixed, but you can just look at output. For example, you would set someone up on a test that you know is primarily going to be using carbohydrates, and that even that's messy. So this would be 20, 30-second wind gate is what we classically use in exercise phys. I was taught for years on end, I can pull up tons of books on my bookshelf that say this, that a 20-second wind gate, so you get on either a bike or a rower and you warm up and then, okay, go. And for 20 seconds, you just like your balls are on fire. Like you go as hard as you possibly can. Don't pace it and it's a horrible test to do. Like the first few seconds, you're like, this isn't so bad. Like halfway through, you're like, oh, this is starting to suck. Like 15 seconds in, you're like, somebody replaced my legs with concrete and I'm starting to feel nauseous. And by 20 seconds, you're just horrible. But I was always told that that is very, very short, very, very high output exercise using full body. So you're using a ton of muscular output doing that, even if you're just doing a bike. I was told that is actually anaerobic. You're not really using oxygen, you're using carbohydrates. And then about probably 8 years ago, I saw Aaron Davis and was helping out at a seminar in Austin, stuck a Moxie on this guy, put this poor bastard on a rower, and said, all right, here we go. And had him do, I think it was a 20 or 30-second wind gate. And I'm just like, oh, okay. So at rest, he's at 87%. So it's saying, all right, the muscle is primarily using, oxygen. I'm sorry, it's primarily just hanging out at rest. It's using a lot of oxygen. And then as we watch this whole thing happen, it's going down and down and down. So by the end of the test, he was at like 15%. And so what that sensor is measuring SMO2. So it's measuring oxygen use indirectly at the muscle. And I'm sitting there scratching my head going, "Oh, hold on a sec. Like I was told this is an anaerobic high carbohydrate output. Why the fuck at the end of this test am I seeing a muscle that says it went from an 87% oxygen level to a 19%? That's telling me that this muscle was using a ton of oxygen. That's not anaerobic, that's aerobic." And I'm like, this sensor's a piece of crap. There's no way this thing works. Long story short, I met the guy who developed the device, and I have a whole system of them now. Turns out the device is pretty damn accurate. But what I was not told is that there are always these dials of what you're turning. So as you start the test, yes, it is more anaerobic, it is more carbohydrate. But the longer any test goes on, the more percentage of that actually becomes aerobic and is actually using oxygen. So I explain it to clients all the time of imagine you're like a DJ at a mixing board. You've got like say carbohydrates on the right and fats on the left, and you're always mixing these percentages. And as you go harder for longer, you get more fat use. And as you add more fatigue to the system, you actually get more fat use. So again, can you increase carbohydrate use? Yes. Can you do that by maybe trying to stuff a little bit more glycogen into it? Yes. Can you get a little bit more high end output from ATP PC with supplements like creatine? Yes. But other than that, you can't, other than direct training, to literally train yourself to get to a higher output. Those are going to be your best things to increase carbohydrate use. But what I look at in athletes then is okay, what duration of time do you need to perform? If you need to be on and do high output for 20 seconds and you've got short rest periods between that, maybe like say NHL hockey or something like that, I'm actually going to look more at your aerobic system first to make sure that is not a limiter. And I'm actually wanting to see how well you can use fat as a system to replete the carbohydrate end of the system. Because the things we can do to max out carbohydrate use, probably single digit percentages. And you can get higher, but it's going to take many, many months of training. But a lot of times the people I see are missing the aerobic side, and maybe their VO2 max is only like 35. They should probably be close to 40, 50, 55, depending upon their sport, what they're doing, possibly higher. And so a lot of times, yes, we're trying to solve a carbohydrate issue related to performance, but we're going to train the other side because that is the aerobic side that is getting those ATP levels back up when you've got very, very short rest periods.
Okay, yeah.
Any of
So
that make
that's
any sense?
yes, yeah, yeah. So would you the terms anaerobic, would that be more carbohydrate burning? Aerobic would be more fat?
Yeah, so classically, we're always taught anaerobic is, hey, I'm not using oxygen, and that means carbohydrate use. Classically, we're taught aerobic means using oxygen, using fat. Now, again, I would say both of those are correct. That is a correct interpretation of it. And when I helped write the Triphasic 2 book with Cal, like that was one of the big discussion points we had of, oh, crap. Like, how far down this rabbit hole do I go to try to explain bioenergetics without confusing the crap out of everyone and but making it still useful? So what we ended up doing is like, yes, those definitions are correct. And then we tried to get across the fact that depending on what you're doing, you may have a more mix of those in what you realize, which is what I was just talking about before. And as long as you understand that, you're okay. And then if you go really far down into the weeds, there's stuff showing like glycogen shunt theory and things that maybe even high output exercise is always running through glycolysis, right? The ability to use carbohydrates. And maybe that's why we can't take glycogen all the way to absolute zero. But the replenishment and kind of the background of a lot of those intermediate fuels is actually through the aerobic system. And so, how I simply explain to athletes is okay, anaerobic. If you're only doing anaerobic stuff, okay, how long do you think you can do exercise holding your breath? They're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, that's anaerobic, right? That's literally no oxygen coming in. Not that I would recommend you do this. It's just going to be a very, very short period of time. Oh, okay. Now what happens when you do higher intense exercise? What happens to your breathing? Oh, my breathing rate goes up. Okay. Yes, part of that is to get rid of CO2, but part of that is also to take in oxygen. So again, they're both tightly linked to each other.
Okay, the kind of, poor utilizers of carbs, poor utilizers of fats, what does that look like?
So the two tests I use, so if you don't have any fancy equipment, you don't have a freaking thousands of dollars to spend on a metabolic card or even a Moxie setup or whatever. Like, what do you actually do in the field? Like, what would be a no tech test? And so on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum, I have what I call the two Pop Tart test. For breakfast, can you have two Pop Tarts, nothing else? And how do you feel for the next couple hours? If you want to crawl under your table and take an insulin induced nap, I would make a hard argument that you're probably not very good at using carbs. Most of the time, if we were to look at your outputs are probably on the low end of the spectrum comparatively to other people in your age demographic, etc. Not all the time, but most of the time. Um, Again, this isn't to say you need to eat Pop Tarts every day, but they're very convenient. They're indestructible. The frosting's probably some new ceramic NASA or Elon Musk are looking at. Easy to get. You can get them in any store, almost any country. They're dirt cheap. There's about 80 grams of carbohydrates in a simple form in them. Like expecting people to go order, no, we'll order 80 grams of dextrose or maltodextrin. Like, this is not going to happen. On the other end of the spectrum, for fat use, we know that the lower you push insulin levels, that will push your body to use more fat. So, how would you get low levels of insulin in a safe manner? Just don't eat. I would argue if you can do a fast for 19 to 24 hours, consume some fluid, consume some electrolytes. Yes, you're probably going to be hungry. But if you can do that and relatively function and train and do everything you could normally, I would argue you're probably pretty good at using fat as a fuel. Again, those are probably two field tests. Again, they do tend to be somewhat reliable. Are they perfect? No. But as some people can kind of play around with themselves and get some idea where they're at on the spectrum.
Mm. That Pop-Tart test, they they consume 2, and then if they kinda they get for the next couple hours, they just what's going on? Are they, like, getting a spike in blood sugar and then a big drop, and that's how you're kinda saying they're not good at using carbs because they should have more study or what?
Most likely, they've got some problem with glucose and insulin. You can get at this if you use technology and you poke their finger and you run glucose and insulin at the same time. So I just studied at University of Minnesota where we had people on a treadmill and they were borderline type 2 diabetics. And we were looking at glucose and insulin and a whole bunch of different factors. I spent a year and a half working on this stupid study, and we basically found no difference in what we were investigating. And then the brought it to the PI, the private, or the principal investigator, and he's like, "Oh, well, we're not going to publish this." And I'm like, "Whoa, what do you mean we're not going to publish this? This is my third study. I need to graduate to get the hell out of here." And I spent a year and a half doing this. Long story short, I had to go find another study to do. So um, you can get at by looking at it. Insulin and glucose levels will tell you kind of where you're at on the spectrum. And so, for example, from that study, you would see some people with just sky high glucose. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. Like their body's having a hard time using glucose. They can't dispose of it into tissue. So it's sort of backing up in the bloodstream. They can't stick it into glycogen. They can't put it in liver glycogen. They can't use a process called de novo lipogenesis, convert it into fat, stuff it somewhere else. But then a few times, because the insulin basically to run those labs takes a little bit longer, glucose we could get instantly. So I had to wait on the insulin data for about a week. I think we did an ELISA on it. And so I'm kind of guessing, oh yeah, this person's a mess. This person's a train wreck. This person's okay. And then when you get the insulin numbers back, you're like, oh, some people with sky high glucose, their insulin was elevated, but not too bad. Other people who had, moderate glucose, which again in this study was like, 110, 125, it's still elevated for sure. A couple of those people had absolutely sky high insulin. And so I would argue that those people are much farther down the progression, right? Because their body is saying, oh, we don't want this high level of glucose hanging out in the bloodstream. So we're going to put out more insulin to try to get it out. Oops, that didn't work because a lot of the tissues are insulin sensitive. So we're going to put out more insulin and more insulin and more insulin. And eventually, at some point, even maxing out insulin isn't solving the issue that they're seeing. And so I think there's this progression over time. And there's different ways in the lab you can measure this and indices like HOMA-IR and all these different, testing of things to do. But at the base level, your body is having a hard time disposing of glucose. Insulin is one of the main signals to try to get it the hell out of the bloodstream. So insulin's like a fuel selector switch. So high levels of insulin will actually push you to use more carbohydrates, right? Because if we have more muscle movement, we've got more glute floor translocation, non-insulin mediated uptake, all this kind of stuff, muscle doing things to suck up more glucose will solve the issue. Which is why for even like type 2 diabetics and just general metabolic health, shocker, movement, exercise, training, lifting heavy stuff, walking, all those things are so beneficial because that allows muscle to one, be more sensitive to glucose, and then two, acutely pull that glucose out and start using it as a fuel or potentially store it.
So those Pop Tart people that consume, is the thought their glucose is elevated for a long period of time and they can't get rid of it and they're kicking out more and more insulin and it's just ineffective?
Yeah, at some point their mechanics are goofed up. So I've done, some blood tests on people and you'll see insulin or I'm sorry, glucose spike really high and then drop. You'll see I'm sorry, glucose go up and stay elevated for a period of time. If you want to do the poor man's version of this, which I've done and I freaking hate needles, but I've done it just to see what happens. Yeah, you can do that and poke your finger with a glucometer, or now you can use CGMs and look at it, and you'll see the profile of glucose over time. The two things you're looking for is one, does it spike super high and then kind of drop, or does it stay elevated longer? The people who tend to be more symptomatic, again, it's general, are the people who spike and then tend to drop because your body is wired to not go hypoglycemic at all costs, right? Your body can live for a while in an elevated state of high glucose. Yes, eventually will that glycate some of your tissue and increase AGEs and mess up your tendons and your muscle and all that stuff? Absolutely. But that's a longer term problem. Acutely, if your blood glucose just plummets super low, you're dead, right? So most of all the counter regulatory mechanisms in the body are designed to prevent you from going too low. So things like stress response, cortisol response, your epinephrine, norepinephrine, all those things are designed to try to prevent you from going a little bit too low. And the good part is, in someone who's functioning healthy, it's really, really hard to make a healthy person hypoglycemic. But you start getting those systems to be dysregulated, you start getting into disease, type 2 diabetics, etc. You can become more dysregulated, and you can unfortunately see these really big lows that are very dangerous.
Okay, the AGE, the advanced glycation end products, that's one of the big things in the tendon metabolic health side is like this chronic hyperglycemia, like a type 2
Yep.
diabetic would just have these. Um, and I have wondered, you said it's a long-term problem. How long do you think that needs to go on for you to start to get these negatives?
I don't know if we have any idea. It probably depends on. We do know for sure by looking at diabetics that their risk of tendon stuff, and I think you'd probably agree, definitely goes up. Now, again, the more uncontrolled they are, the higher blood glucose they have, the worse it's probably going to be. The pro and the con with some of that studies is they're only looking at acute injuries also. And if you're not doing a lot of movement, you might push out your overall risk just because you're not doing anything that's taxing the muscle more. So I think it's harder to get exact timelines on it. There's some cell culture petri dish stuff that I have no idea how well that even transfers to humans, to be honest. And the other part is that a lot of times we just don't, up until recently, we don't have good numbers on what levels of glucose they're even hanging out at. Now we can get CGMs, we can get a lot more better data on that. Yeah, so I would say I don't really have any time course on it. It's
Mm.
probably months to years and probably not weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that someone was speculating, I think, with the NFL lockout way back in the
Mm.
day, and they had
Yeah,
watched
yeah,
all those
yeah.
pictures, and they were speculating that it was like a lack of movement, advanced glycation end product. But I'm like, that feels like that has to take months, like a long time. Not something that's going to happen in days. had that question as well from people, and I'm like, I don't think you can mess. I think it takes a long time for you to mess yourself up in that way. It's not going to happen in a day of high carbohydrates or something like that.
No, I mean, my I don't know what your thoughts are, but my thought on that is just, if you look at Tim Gabbard's stuff, the chronic load spike you saw in those people, I think, is astronomical,
Hmm.
right? Because a lot of them were like, I'm not going to do a lot, and then, oh shit, we're back.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, okay, this idea of metabolic flexibility, the carbs and the fats, going back and forth between the two. Um, How do you kind of stay metabolically flexible? Is this both from like a nutrition standpoint? Are you suggesting like periods of high carbs and periods of low carbs? And then are you suggesting like people do a good dose of anaerobic training, or what are you kind of thinking to, yeah, keep this person like quote unquote metabolically flexible?
A lot of it depends on what are their overall goals and what is the cost, right? So if we look at high level endurance athletes who are running marathons or like elite level athletes, they're pretty much always running using carbohydrates. Kipchoge, doing the breaking to, what was he at, 130, 140 grams of carbohydrates per hour, right? They're not worried about, oh, let's go low carb, right? They're worried about performance at all costs. And again, you could argue that health may not be their number one thing either. I have seen data from high level marathon and half marathon people on a metabolic cart that they literally had no crossover period, meaning at no point during the entire test did they get to even 50% of fat use, even at super low intensities. All right. So super low intensities, you should hit, 70, 80, 90% fat use. Now, they were competitive. They were, pretty highly ranked. I could make an argument from a health standpoint because they've lost metabolic flexibility that it may not be the best for their long term health. Again, exercise itself is incredibly protective. So, could they do that approach for probably a few years and be fine? Yes. But again, these are just, consults and data I've seen. If they were my client, what I do is like I say, hey, okay, what are your goals? What do you want to do? Okay, here's some things I'm seeing in terms of the cost. Here's part of the cost that you're paying to your nervous system, your metabolism, whatever. We'll do a lot of blood work to try to look at other parameters and keep an eye on it. And at the end of the day, that athlete has to decide, okay, where is this line for me as an individual? I mean, even for myself, like, okay, what are my goals? Yeah, I want to pick up the 175-pound inch dumbbell, have some stuff on the rower. Body weight, body fat now is probably higher than maybe what it air quote should be, but all my blood work is all fine. Everything there is good. So, sort of my line in the sand is okay. At some point, if I'm not making progress in the state I'm in, or my blood work starts looking a little bit wonky, I'm probably gonna have to reassess and be like, okay, let's cut back on calories and things like that. So I use metabolic flexibility as just sort of a marker with that. In a perfect world, for most people, I would make the argument that you can get to a very high level and keep metabolic flexibility pretty high. And when you do that, it does appear that your blood markers and everything else will be pretty good. So, for example, on the other end, I've had athletes on 500, 550 grams of carbs per day, like not even a carb cycling approach. And metabolic heart testing, they still use fat pretty well. Their bloods are all good. Everything is fine. Now, again, they're doing a lot of exercise, like their stress is under control. They're eating mostly whole foods. Like, so they're doing a lot of things. I don't think you can take the average American whose butt looks like a couch cushion and dump 500 grams of carbs in them and expect them to have that turn out real well. It's probably not going to turn out well. Um, and then on the fat end of the spectrum, I used to use resting metabolic rate and look at how well they're using fat during that. But I do think that's somewhat problematic. What I noticed in a couple of people, this is a couple of years ago now, is that their RER, which is the respiratory exchange ratio, which is just simply the marker of a percentage of fat to percentage of carbs you're using. So if your RER is zero point 0.7, that says 100% of the fuel you're burning at that point is fat. If it's 1.0 or higher, 100% of the fuel you're using at that point in time is carbohydrates. And RMR, so resting metabolic rate, you're not doing anything, typically done first thing in the morning. You would expect it to be very low if they're good at using fat. However, I found in some athletes who are doing high amounts of carbohydrate intake, their RER will be like 0.85, zero point 0.9 sometimes. And at first I was like, oh crap, the metabolic cart, burped and it's all goofed. It wasn't, trained, whatever, redo it. And so did this a whole bunch of times, did this on myself. And what I realized is if you have a high background of carbohydrates, it does tend to push you a little bit more at rest to probably carbohydrate use. But what's cool is if we put them on a bike at just 50 watts, which is basically almost nothing, boom, they would drop almost immediately to like 0.72, 0.73. So the minute we stimulated the system just a little bit with a low amount of work, they would normalize. So anytime now, like on consults and stuff like that, and they're like, "Hey, we got this high level athlete. We had to send him for all this metabolic heart testing, and everything's great, but his RER is like 0.93." I'm like, "How many carbohydrates does he eat?" "Oh, it's like 400 a day." Let me guess. Is he doing a lot of training? Yeah. So redo the test, put them under about 50 watts of just easy exercise, and let me know if it normalizes. If it doesn't, and sometimes it doesn't, okay, now I'm probably a little bit more concerned, more from a health standpoint. So that's something that there isn't much data on. There's a couple studies that have kind of hinted at this. So there's a couple ways you can kind of look at it through that lens.
Mm. I went to Saint Scholastica for grad school. For
Oh, that's
physiology.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
I
We
loved
had
it
a
there.
yeah. One of my friends was like single digit body fat, and he like needed carbs all day, basically.
Yeah.
So like, and I don't know if we did the RER. I think we did, and he was like burning carbs all the time.
Oh, yeah.
But, I don't know, I always had that speculation of, like, if you have a chronically high blood sugar, like, I wonder if this is bad, even though you're super lean, but it was just kind of a speculation. One of those
What I
other
would
thing.
say on that spectrum
Yeah.
is if you can't downregulate to use fat and you're stuck on that high carbohydrate end of the spectrum, which we have seen, I talked to this about my buddy Luke Lehman too. Like we've had resting lactate measurements on people hit 2 or 3 millimolar just sitting there talking to us. We're like, whoa, like they're burning so many carbs, they're spinning off lactate at rest. Of course, they're generally a metabolic wreck, like, "Oh, I can't do any exercise, their output is bad, their sleep is bad." They're so sympathetic that they're just running on carbs all the time,
Mm,
and one of the hallmarks of those people is that they have to eat with a really high frequency, like, fasting is virtually impossible for them to do, and I think it's because they can't downregulate to use fat as a fuel very well. So there are a lot of those people out there. Some of them are even high level athletes who just, were overreached, overtrained, things of that nature too.
wow. Yeah, this guy, he was one of my close friends, but he was like a type A personality and stressed all the time, and
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
I don't think there was any fasting. I don't think he could fast, but you look at him with the shirt off, and it's like he has the best looking physique in all of
Oh, yeah.
yeah. One other aspect of this whole tendon metabolic health thing, we kind of touched on the chronic blood sugar thing, is obesity, and I think they talk about obesity just meaning like more inflammation. I think. How does obesity affect this metabolic flexibility?
It tends to just make it all worse. So we did a study where we were looking at this is some pilot data that we took the RER and we put people under steady state exercise. And so the classic textbook thing would be, okay, you're on a low level exercise. Your RER should be, let's say it's 0.76. But you do like, friggin', hundreds of metabolic heart tests and you're standing there watching it and you're watching the numbers, make sure the machine doesn't goof up and you're watching the athlete, but they don't, they take a while to run. And so you're watching this number and I'm like, wait a minute, 0.76, 0.78, 0.74, like the RER is moving around. And you're like, well, this isn't supposed to happen. This is steady state exercise. You check the treadmill, you check the bike, they're doing the same output. And then you would have someone else come up and it would be like 0.75, 0.75, 0.75. We're like, well, that's weird. So it's not a machine thing. It's not a machine error, which it could be. And so our hypothesis was that this fine scale variability in RER, maybe that's a marker for metabolic flexibility and metabolic health. Just like heart rate variability, fine scale variability in heart rate is a marker for parasympathetic tone or status of your autonomic nervous system. And when you look across other physiologic systems, the ones that are functioning well, fight to gait to whatever you're looking at. So our hypothesis was that this variability in RER is a indirect marker for metabolic flexibility. And we did do some pilot data. The pilot data did show that that was a factor, but then we had to back up and go, well, is this measurement even stable if we just have a bunch of healthy people come in on multiple days and run the measurement? And so that was part of that was one of the second study I did for my thesis. So we ran all that data and showed that, yep, the marker does appear to be, pretty stable. And that was 2015. And so far, no one has replicated it to see if it really does mean it's metabolically flexible or not. So all that to say that when you see obesity, when we did the pilot study, we were purposely taking a group of people who were obese and a group of people who were lean. And it so happened, again, it's a pilot study, so you could argue statistics maybe weren't there because we just couldn't get enough enrollment. At least in that study, and there's some other data to support this, the leaner people generally were more metabolically flexible. Now, again, could you find individuals in that population, given enough people, that that is not true? Yes, I've ran into those people and tested them myself. But in general, obesity just tends to throw a monkey wrench in everything. So we talked a lot about the insulin dynamics and all that stuff, but my buddy Ben House says, which I like, is that calories are just kind of your trump card, meaning that all other things being equal, if someone is in a massive caloric excess, and especially if they're not running energy through the system, right? They're just not moving a lot. Literally, you could pick a system and it tends to go in the wrong direction, right? And that's the old Stephen Blair thing. Could you be also be fat but also fit? And if you look at that data long enough, the longer someone stays air quote fit, but is getting heavier and heavier, at some point, 2, 3, 4, 5 years into it, they almost always have metabolic issues. Now, again, could you do enough exercise to potentially offset that? I think you can. You can look at studies in sumo wrestlers and some, other athletes, but those are edge cases that are doing massive amounts of exercise and energy output. So the takeaway I would say is if you're at a higher flux rate, you're just moving more energy through the system. That is incredibly protective, independent of body fat and body weight. However, at some point, that's probably going to catch up with you, and most people are not going to do enough exercise to counteract that. At some point, if you do get heavy enough, especially if that's more body fat and you have less muscle, that's gonna catch up with you, and pretty much any system you look at that at some point is gonna be going in the wrong direction.
Have you looked at the GLP-1s? I
Yeah.
think it was, who's Howard Lux, is that his name? I've been following his on Twitter
Yeah,
for a long time, and I think he posted there was a study on, like, improving cartilage. I think it was improving cartilage health, these
I just
something
saw it,
along those
yeah.
lines, and I kinda look at I look at the osteoarthritis literature, and I'm like, I think the same thing's happening in tendons. Is just like that seems a little bit behind. Yeah, have you looked at these drugs and what's happening? Is it just like these people are consuming less? They're getting what's it doing to metabolic flexibility? Is it making them better or what?
Most of the data I've seen now, again, this gets complicated because there's GLP-1, GLP-2, and now GLP-3. I th I'd have to look at the company for GLP-3s did release a press release. I'd have to check again if the full study was released. As of a couple months ago, it wasn't. So I'd say GLP-3s, the jury is still out. I mean, you go on bodybuilding forums, all this stuff, people are like, "Oh my god, it's the greatest thing ever invented." But again, who knows, right? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I mechanistic wise, I have some doubts over that, but so GLP-1s definitely blunt appetite, which to me, in and of itself, if we only stayed there, is like fascinating. So if you would have come to me like 5 years ago and say, "Hey, man, did you know in 5 years we're going to have these drugs? They're so effective that people are going to be crushing their appetites so much that they're going to be chronically undereating. They're not going to have enough protein. They're going to be losing lean body mass, and they're just going to be dropping weight like crazy." I'd have been like, "What are you talking about? That's never gonna happen in my lifetime. You're insane. That is never gonna happen." Hunger, appetite, all those are multifactorial, redundant, survival-based mechanisms, and I was wrong. That's what we have, like, you could argue the lean body mass loss with some of the trials of GLP-1s. Granted, most of these people are not exercising, they're not lifting heavy ass weights. They're probably consuming too little of protein. We don't know for sure if that's a GLP-1 effect or if they've just dropped everything else. The pharmaceutical company said, well, we'll solve this issue by actually spending money to look at new anabolics now. There's a bunch in phase 2, phase 3 trials. Um, I don't know if there's a direct mechanism there. Right now, if I were to bet, I would say it's just a low protein, no stimulus. You just slashed your calories too much. GLP-2s do have, I'd say, better outcomes. People don't get quite as nauseous. They don't have quite as much stopping of food going through their system. They might be seeing better metabolic effects, but the trials to sort all that out are super hard because you would, in essence, the air quote perfect trial would be give someone, say, a GLP-1, 2, or 3, make them eat enough so they don't lose weight, and then let the other group lose weight and give both of them the same drug, right? And that way you could see, is there, and obviously you would have a control group too, right? So across those 3 groups, then you could see, was it the weight loss? Was it the drug? Or was there no difference? So right now, most of the trials all have significant amount of weight loss in association with the drug. So again, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you want approval, that's what you would get if you're trying to do it. So I understand why those trials are done. I do think there's probably some metabolic effect with the drugs themselves. There's a lot of animal and supportive data there. But if I were to guess, I think a lot of it is just by the amount of weight loss. And you can look at this and kind of get at it by looking at how metabolic health improves with other trials where they have shown significant weight loss. And again, pretty much almost everything improves. Your caveat is, as long as you get some amount of exercise, you don't lose too much muscle mass, and depending upon what the outcomes of the trial are. So I do think they are useful. I think they're probably for most people a net benefit. The caveat where I do get a little worried is there is some increases in heart rate. There is some changes in HRV. Those do seem to normalize once people go off the drugs, but there's plenty of data. I did a whole article on that the other day. I would make the argument that we don't have enough long-term data. Again, if people are going to use it for a short couple months, we probably have pretty good data on that. My fear, though, is that GLP-1s will be the same as TRT. Like, once people go on, I don't think they're ever going to go off. Right, and that's my argument with TRT. Like, again, TRT can be extremely beneficial. I don't personally use it, but again, I have clients who do. Talk to your doc, make sure it's the right thing, all that kind of stuff. But most endocrinologists, if you really push them, will say there are a small percentage of people who go on TRT that they can never come off. Like, we can't get their own endogenous production ever started again. So you're probably going to be on it the rest of your life, which again, some people don't care, whatever. That's your personal decision. That's fine. So my fear is that GLP-1s, because they work so well, people are gonna be like, "Oh, man, bro, I tried to go off GLP-1s, those donuts, man, I just kept eating donuts," right? G They don't hire a trainer, they don't hire someone to show them what to do, they don't change their habits, they're relying on the drug to provide an appetite suppression effect, which it does. But I just get worried if you go years into the future, 1, is there a tolerance effect, right? So tachyphylaxis, are they still gonna need just higher and higher doses of it? We don't really know. Of course, there are going to be some people that are probably just not going to see the same effect. And then there's just no physiologic free lunch. Like, there's just no instance where you can provoke and push a system really hard in one direction and not have any significant change. And again, the changes are not always bad. They're not always side effects, but yeah. So that's my main concern is people using them as a lifestyle drug of like, F it. I'm just going to stay out on the rest of my life.
Yeah. You got time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
good.
Okay. Good. All right. I was telling you, uh, I ran into God. Is it Tom Hebert? That's got to be what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
useful
In London.
coach, taught
So
my said
yeah,
I.
exactly. We back in the day, Be Activated was kind of how me and him
Yep,
connected, and then yeah,
through Doug.
you were involved with that as well. But he's doing nutrition. for climbers, and I was asking him on like tendon health, nutrition, and I can't find really anything useful online. And then I get these anecdotes of people being like they went carnivore and their tendon pain magically cleared up, and I'm like, okay, I guess these are just anecdotes. And he was kind of getting at maybe it's this low inflammation from eating that diet, but we didn't really get into that. What are your thoughts here? If there are anecdotes of people being like they changed their diet up, they're eating carnivore, which is like very, very limiting of what they can eat. Is it a lower inflammation diet, or what do you think's going on?
That would be my guess. I mean, I have one client who I did hands-on work here, got many years ago. Just a train wreck, right? If anyone's done any hands-on work, like if you do enough of it, you can kind of feel where like, ooh, this tissue is mad. Like it just feels just not right, boggy, fluidy, like just I don't know. It's just a hard thing to explain, but it just didn't feel good. So we did some stuff. His movement got a little bit better, but never significantly got better. And I'm like scratching my head and I'm like, hey, like, what are you doing for nutrition and stuff? And it was not just bad, it was a freaking train wreck. And so, I mean, we didn't do anything crazy. We just said, hey, let's bump your protein up. Let's get a lot more micronutrition. Let's give you some carbs and make sure you can, do a little bit more exercise, that kind of stuff. Nothing crazy. And this was just kind of more of a one-off consult. He wasn't a client of mine. Didn't see him for like 3, 4 months. Comes back. He's like, "Oh my god, dude, I feel so much better." I'm like, "What the hell did you do?" He's like, "Oh, I did the thing you told me to do." I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And he had like horrible joint pain. It's like all joint pain resolved, like attitude, everything was better. So I do think there is something with that. And I have had some people have those results from carnivore. To me, a carnivore diet is kind of the end of the road of an elimination diet. So I've had, clients and people do it as just a way of, okay, let's just do a reset. Let's just pull out as much stuff as we possibly can, get your gut fixed, maybe get your inflammation down, get your body cooperating again. And then we'll, at some point, we'll slowly reintroduce things at another point. If you look at, as you know, like there's a debate in the tendon world about tendinosis versus tendonitis. In general, osis is more the collagen gets scrambled, the soft tissue is all goofy. Tendonitis is more of an inflammation type response. So I do kind of use that with clients to try to give me an idea of, okay, am I going to more target isometrics, maybe some eccentrics, some collagen, some things to try to change the architecture, or is their overall diet just a disaster and it seems to be more tendonitis and we're going to go more after inflammation? We may try things like, you know, curcumin, high dose fish oil. I have a fish oil test we give them. So poke your finger, bleed on this piece of paper, send it in. It'll run every lipid in your body. They'll tell us EPA, DHA, red blood cell content, all this kind of stuff. We'll do that, and then just clean up your diet, eat more micronutrition. Maybe we could play with some fasting if you can tolerate it or not. At the end of all of that, maybe we end up doing a carnivore diet. Like if we keep pulling stuff out and we find that, okay, this fiber wasn't good, or if low FODMAPs or lactose or common offenders, gluten, etc. So that would be my guess, And again, I've seen blood work from people doing carnivore that looks amazing. I have a client right now who I was trying so hard to get blood work from him beforehand, and we weren't able to get it, but I wanna say January 1st? Maybe it was no, December. Maybe it was mid-December. He weighed in at 247, and then he just sent me photos the other day. He was doing BIA to track everything, so body comp analysis, which again has its pros and cons. I wanna say he's down to 219 right now. He's gained 12 pounds of muscle, lost a bunch of fat, and he's literally just doing hardcore carnivore, breakfast and dinner. He's got a busy schedule, drinks water during the day. Again, he did some other lifestyle changes. He stopped drinking alcohol, is only drinking water now instead of a ton of energy drinks, etc. Still training heavy, like started training actually heavier than what he was before. So I think you can see a lot of positive changes with it. Again, the last caveat is just like with keto, I've seen a few people where their blood lipids go absolutely, completely squirrely off the chart. I would say that's not the norm, but every once in a while, there are people who just they don't seem to handle, high fat very well. You can argue about maybe it's a genetic thing, maybe they have hypercholesterolemia, things like that. So I would say to anyone making any dietary change, talk to your doc, or if you want to run blood work on yourself and look at it for performance metrics, get some baseline blood work, do the thing you're going to do, and then at least just get basic lipid panel, CBC, CMP, 90 days later, 60 days later, just to get an idea of what's going on.
Mm. This reminds me of one of those other domains of the metabolic health is the hypercholesterolemia.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm gonna ask you because I haven't dug into it myself, just lack of interest. Like the diabetes and the high blood sugar is interesting to me. My sister, younger sister growing up had type 1 diabetes,
Mm.
and my mom and my dad's side, a lot of type 2 diabetes, just
Mm.
just like overeating, lack of activity. But the cholesterol one, and then there's this research on statins, and I think isn't there research with statins and tendon health kind of being poor for tendon health? I don't know if you have you looked into this at all? What's going on there?
I haven't looked at that for quite a while. I looked at some of it. It's probably been a couple of years, to be honest. And at that time, I was like, I don't know. I mean, if I were to hypothesize a guess, we know that statins probably have, depending on what you read, single digit percentage of people that just have a lot of muscle pain as soon as they go on. And I have had clients who have that. And if you look at what statins are, they're HMG coenzyme A reductase inhibitors, which all in fancy English means that they block the same metabolic pathway as coenzyme Q10. And so many times just giving athletes more coenzyme Q10 will alleviate some of their side effects. Again, obviously, talk to your physician, talk to your doc about that. There generally isn't any known other effects with it. So that's probably what I would look at first and see if that makes any difference. So maybe it's an energy production thing that's leading to more, tendon issues. I don't know. Um, that would be my guess. So pretty much anyone who has a statin, that's the first question I'm going to ask them. Go back to your doc, ask them if it's okay if you can take coenzyme Q10. There's a debate: do you use ubiquinol or ubiquinone? One's a reduced form or not? I don't know. I don't even know if it matters much at this point. I've gone back and forth on that probably a dozen times, and just take some. I think you'll probably be better.
Yeah. Okay. All right, last one I got for you. So you said you had a consult here and we talked too long before we started recording. The So yeah, we were speculating before we got on here about like you painted this picture, which I always do, of like, okay, we know the extremes of metabolic health negatives and how bad they are for tendons, how bad they are for tendon healing. But if we talk about trying to like get healthier, talk about all these metabolic domains and trying to get healthier, maybe we could accelerate these things. If that's where you're coming from, and I like that distinction of the tendonitis versus tendinosis. If you got that inflammatory person,
Yeah.
maybe try to take care of like the systemic things going on. Um, yeah, what type of things would you be looking at from this? Like, okay, we know what's bad metabolic health for tendons. What would you be doing to try to like optimize metabolic health?
Yeah, so let me know if this answers your question. As someone who does more grip sport stuff, and my main goal is to pick up the 175-pound inch dumbbell. So it's this big ass dumbbell with like the handles the size of a pop can. Right. So for years it was called the unliftable dumbbell, and it was, in vaudeville shows, and they'd take these huge guys up there and no one could pick it up. Even now, I think at the Arnold, and they like Sornex or Burt usually has a booth with the inch there with like $100 bill under it, and says, "Hey, I'll give you $100 if anyone can pick this up who's not a competitor here." And he's like, "Nobody picks it up, right?" So it's a weird thing to look at it because like 175 pounds for a one hand deadlift, that's not, to people who lift, that's not heavy, but it's the handle and the shape, and most of that probably revolves around the structure of the soft tissue to hold that position long enough to not get deformed in any way. Obviously, that's muscles involved with that too. So from a greedy perspective, I've tried to look at anything that would accelerate soft tissue healing or adaptations. The only things I've come up with are, yes, I think metabolic health is a big part of it. To what degree, I don't know. Just be metabolically healthy. Don't have high glucose. Make sure your insulin isn't rhine. Make sure most of your blood panels all look good. Outside of that, I haven't found anything that would accelerate it unless it's accelerating your ability to train more frequent. So number one would be the exposure to the system, to the thing you're trying to do. If I can increase my frequency on that, recover and get back to zero and do it again, I'm going to be able to compress training into a shorter window because I'm going to get more exposure to it, right? Because we know directly that helps. If I can get on a lighter bell, if I can get 1,000 reps in a week versus 400, right? I just make up numbers. Like the 1,000 reps, I'm going to make faster progress. There is some stuff from we've talked about in the past with Keith Barr's work and Shaw and other people, you know, 15, 12 grams of collagen, 40 to 60 minutes, maybe a small amount of vitamin C before training does seem to help with tendon changes. Again, that data is debatable, and how much that transfers exactly to humans, I'd say, is up in the air. But the argument I would make is that there's almost virtually no downside. Right? It's going to cost you a little bit of money, whatever. I'd say probably just do it. I played with cycles of doing it versus not doing it. And anecdotally, and on N1, I just feel so much better doing it. I can't point to a huge bump in training load or effects, but I can tell you from my joints feel niggly to soft tissue just feels crappy to soft tissue feels much better. Almost always my soft tissue and joints feel better. Again, could be 100% could be placebo. Um, outside of that, the only other thing I played with lately is I think if you can do things to increase neuroplasticity before exercise and then downregulate as hard as you can post exercise, that does seem to result in a little bit of faster gains, but the gains become more permanent. Like, so in the past, like if I was doing double overhand axle, I just hit before we left on a trip, I hit 290 for a single. And in the past, when I would come back, my singles would probably be 275, 270, right? You kind of work your way up to that peak, but then when you take a little bit of time off, you just go back to normal training, you're always kind of below that thing and you're trying to get that thing to be your new floor. But lately I've noticed, I've done this twice. I just tested it in the gym the other day and it was 290 again. I got 295 to my knees. So it was basically the same as what I left. So I think there's something to trying to increase neuroplasticity before training to get the better maybe neurologic response, maybe it's a metabolic effect, and then just trying to get back to baseline faster. So I was playing around with the shift wave device for quite a while. It's a chair that does these little, I'd say, pressure waves in conjunction with listening to some audio stuff. And I've done like a omega wave or it's now OTO and HRV and stuff before and after, and it definitely does seem to shift you pretty hard into a parasympathetic tone. Um, so I don't know. That's the only thing I've come up with lately that seems to help. But yeah, if you have any ideas on anything that accelerates soft tissue adaptations, like I would love to hear it. And I've asked tons of people, researchers, like people who do arm wrestling, like people who use, we'll say, every drug known to man, like maybe GH, which again I haven't used. I haven't used anabolics or anything like that, or even peptides. BBC 157. I don't know, I'm still on the fence about it. I've had clients play with it through a physician since 2018, and I would say 60% were like, "Oh my god, this is the greatest thing you've ever had me do," and 40% were like, "I couldn't notice any difference whatsoever." Same peptide, same protocol, same doc, again, all used for different issues and different pathologies, so who knows?
And that was the injections?
That was all injections. I have played around a few with using oral. I mean, BPC should be orally active. There's animal data to show that. It's one of the rare peptides that probably is orally active. But yeah, that was all by injection. And again, if you talk to Keith Barr, he's like, "Yeah, we put a ton of that shit in a petri dish, didn't do anything."
Uh-huh.
They're like, "Well, what was happening?" His theory is if you're doing site injection, maybe it's a small micro trauma to the collagen and to the soft tissue itself that's triggering the body to remodel. And maybe if people are getting a benefit, that's what it's from. So I don't know.
Yeah, I know. So then it's like you could just poke a needle
Correct.
and with nothing in it. Yeah. Yeah, I have heard him say that. Okay.
Do you
Yeah,
have any soft tissue, speedy things to help me?
no, I don't think there are any. That's the problem. And I was having a conversation last night and I was like, I'm pretty nihilistic at the point I'm at. I'm only 34, but I'm like, I've just seen so many things, and so many things have been a letdown, or it's like,
Oh,
you know.
most everything I've tried has been a letdown.
So it's like if someone's new, like if someone's new into asking me about like, hey, should I take collagen protein? Now, if I'm like in my normal mood, I'll be pretty negative and just be like, ah, whatever. But I the placebo effect. If I
For
can, if
sure.
they don't ask me, go and just buy it yourself and let the placebo effect work for you
Yeah,
for a while. So yeah,
better's better.
I wonder if there's something in the I mean, there's rock climbing, there's a few rock climbing people I've talked to with the finger tendons.
Yeah,
It just seems like I spend so much of my time with the Achilles and patellar, which are very different tendons that are so much thicker and I don't know if they're more adaptive than the finger ones. I don't know. There's a lot of things that I just don't know. And then at the same time, I get back to like tendons are tendons. You know, they're all pretty much made up of the same things, and they're gonna recover in their own time frames. What you were talking about though reminded me of the circadian rhythm. So there's like
yeah,
circadian rhythm work with the tendons, and I'm like, it looks like when they have tendinopathy, the circadian rhythm is disrupted in those cells, and it to me, it just looks like they're overproducing, like they're overproducing collagen. I don't know if the MMPs are overactive as well, the things that are degrading it. So maybe it's like when you have these people in the tendinopathy or they're getting the structural damage, those tendons are already so overactive where it's like maybe what we need to do is get them to go back to their normal state, which is like them just being pretty kind of quote unquote inert, like they're kind of just settling down. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But I do know if you load your tendons more, they do become more active versus someone who's more
yes,
sedentary. So yeah, I don't know the secret. And it's like, what are we going to try to do? Accelerate tendons more when they're already accelerated in tendinopathy state? Or what's the right thing to do? Or do we just not really need to care about tendons, let them do their own thing, and look at the muscles and look at the bones, and maybe there's more leeway with those type of things. Yeah.
yeah. And I don't know, it's not really my theory, but if you're looking at hypertrophy of tissues altogether, I've often wondered if bone stimulation is the rate limiter. Meaning, if you can get a heavy enough stimulus to activate the piezoelectric effect in bone, does that have downstream effects that's automatically going to hit muscle and tendon?
Mm.
I don't know. That's just something I pulled out of my ass, but it's something I
So
wonder.
you would need if you're gonna hit the bone, you need more of those like high impact type
Potentially
thing.
high impact or high bending stress,
Yeah.
right? So you're back to kind of axial loading stuff, right? So if this is my femur, the biggest stress for it would be stressing it on both ends where the bone or almost torque it out. You're trying to get the bone, air quotes, to bend, but it's not, right? Because that's probably one of the bigger stresses you could impose on it. Obviously, impulse and impact is another one, just a different profile.
Yeah. I
I don't
know
know.
that when it gets like the piezoelectric thing, it kind of gets woo woo for me, and then you know you get these certain tribes of people that seem like they've kind of lost the plot, and I'm like, this is a little bit too crazy for me.
Yeah.
Um,
We
but
do know that
yeah,
PMF though is approved for bone healing, right? So you look at EBI devices and things like that. So we do know that that does seem to go the other way also.
yeah, okay, yeah. Let's leave it at that. We're gonna keep talking. So, all right, Mike, tell people where to find you online.
Best place is MikeTNelson.com. I have a newsletter, so most of the probably 80-90% of the content I put out right now goes through the newsletter, which is free to sign up. So it's Fitness Insider newsletter. Just go to MikeTNelson.com, go to the little button that says sign up for the newsletter. That's probably the best place. If you have questions, just hit reply there. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. I do have some stuff on Instagram, which is Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and then the podcast, which is the Flex Diet Podcast, which you've also been on in the past. So I have to have you back on again. I can ask you all my tendon questions.
Yeah. I got to come out to Minneapolis. I'm close
Yeah,
by.
when are you coming up?
Let's do some grip training. You can show
Yeah,
me
well,
if
I got all the
I can
shit
if I can
here.
pick anything up. So yeah, we'll be in contact. Hopefully do that soon. All right, Mike. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. That was super fun.